so that is completely outdated. All of that information has changed. For one, MySpace is not as popular as it used to be. But again, yeah, it's all changed completely, and how we communicate has changed completely. And you saw a little blurb in there about folks trusting peer reviews on products. And it's interesting because since this video came out, there's been an explosion in an area called brand management or reputation management. And what they do is they get paid a lot of money to surf the web and look for reviews that are done by peers and work to get those reviews pulled. Because so many folks trust peer reviews more than they trust actual reviews from professionals. And it's interesting because I've heard folks, as we've traveled around, that have suggested that we are allowed to, we should develop some sort of a system where the deaf community can write reviews about interpreters, and then they can go and look at those reviews and then select an interpreter. And I can only imagine how that would turn out if that ever came about, because you don't click with one client and then all of a sudden you have a bad review, and then it becomes very difficult to work. I say that because I would imagine that it wouldn't be unheard of. I would imagine that if somebody pushed hard enough to get it, that there might be a way to actually do it. I know that there is that company now that allows you to go online and actually select your interpreter from a list. I forgot the name of the company. Yeah. And you can go online onto their database and look at all of the interpreters, look at their qualifications and their bio, and you can individually select the interpreter that you want. So times are changing, and it used to be we could say, well, it's all right, I'm not interested in that. But unfortunately, we don't have that luxury anymore. We have to embrace the change that's coming. So again, yeah, it was 2009. So we're going to talk a little bit about video remote interpreting. And for the folks that haven't done it, we're going to talk about kind of what it is. Also, if anybody needs one, I printed some of the standard practice papers for VRI. If anybody doesn't have one and would like one. I didn't print one for everyone because it's 14 pages long and it's available on the internet, but there are 12 copies there if anybody actually wants one. And so some of this presentation on VRI is going to come from the standard practice paper itself. So interesting enough, this photo I found when I was doing research, and this is from the 1970s, and this was a video phone that AT&T put out in the 70s, and then they eventually phased it out because nobody was interested in it. It was a subscription service. So we've been playing with the technology to communicate in this way for a long time. Again, this was in the early 1970s. So I'm not going to read all of this because, again, it comes directly from the standard practice paper, but it's interesting to look at how RID views the VRI, and then we're going to look at the definition of VRI that NAD puts out. So it says here that it's a fee-based interpreting service, that it's arranged through service contracts, obviously, and it's not regulated by the Federal Communications Commission. So, I mean, that's very similar to what NAD says. They don't emphasize in here as strongly how often or when it should be used. The standard practice paper does talk about specific settings and rules for using it in those settings, but if you compare it to the definition of NAD, right at the very beginning it says when in-person on-site services are not immediately available. They make it very clear in the NAD's definition that it's not a replacement for a live interpreter. The other part that I thought that was interesting when we talk about the definition was, it says, VRI is currently being used in a wide variety of settings, including hospitals, physicians' offices, mental health care settings, police stations, etc. But when you read the rest of the definition, it says that, right here, there are limits to the effectiveness of VRI in some settings, including but not limited to medical, legal, and court situations. So the settings where it's being used are the settings that it has really the most limitations. And it's unfortunate because there are some benefits to VRI if it was used appropriately, but unfortunately it's not always used appropriately. And the other issue that I personally have with VRI is oftentimes the hardware itself. So a person's very ill, they're in the emergency room, and you wheel in a cart with a 10-inch monitor on it and ask them to look at it. Certainly the technology exists where you could wheel in a cart with a 25-inch monitor or a 32-inch monitor, and there are computers that don't even need a tower, so that monitor could actually also be the computer as well, but we don't use that technology. We use things like this, which have very limited range and very limited use in a hospital setting itself. And so I think that's one of the challenges that we have with VRI. Another challenge is oftentimes when hospitals add VRI as an option for assistive technology, they don't necessarily always add an extra Wi-Fi line or a T1 line. So then what you're doing is you're trying to make a video call on an internet connection that you're sharing with every other person that comes into the hospital. And for that reason, calls drop, the call quality is not good, and then it becomes a bad experience for both the hearing consumer and deaf consumers as well. So some other definitions that I found when we were looking up more information about VRI. Here's a federal definition with the code cited there. It describes the same information. It does suggest high speed and wide bandwidth for video connection. Again, not all hospitals are necessarily doing that, or they're skirting that by just using technology that already exists. In other words, connecting to a Wi-Fi signal that the hospital already has. And then this is the definition by the Department of Justice, which it also kind of mirrors the federal regulation that's spelled out. So for the folks that have used VRI, in what settings have you used it, if you don't mind sharing? Medical is where I've used it primarily. Anybody else?
Both times for me was just a business meeting.
Okay.
And we were not actually geographically very far apart, but it was easier for them to find interpreters to have us speak.
So in a business setting, anybody else? Any other settings other than medical or business?
Highly technical.
Okay, that's one of the reasons. There was a study that was done, and that was one of the reasons that was cited for using VRI was exactly that, very specific interpreting needs. So in that case, highly technical was one of the reasons. So other reasons that just a shortage of interpreters. Sometimes we forget living in this area that there are places where there are not interpreters available. There are places where there's only one CDI in the entire state. And I think that sometimes we forget that, but that's another reason that VRI is used is because there's a shortage of interpreters in some areas. Financial reasons is another big area. Did you have a question?
I have a question. Who pays for VRI? So does the hospital pay for this?
Yeah, typically the whatever organization contracts with the VRI company, they're the ones that pay for it. Yeah. And usually there's a couple different ways that they work the contracts. They can either do a fee per minute, they can buy kind of a package of minutes. There's a variety of different ways that they can do it, but they pay directly themselves, the hospital. So emergency substitution, so you come to the emergency room and obviously you need an interpreter right away, and so they pull in an interpreter. And then there's other settings that it can be used as well. Again, it's not regulated by the FCC, so there are questions to think about when we are using VRI, and one of those is confidentiality. If the interpreter is not in a call center, how are we ensuring that confidentiality exists? Because I know at home, I can't guarantee that when I'm on the phone that I'm in a confidential setting. I mean, there's people coming in and out literally all the time, and if I'm talking about somebody's health care, somebody's private information, how can we guarantee that confidentiality exists when we're doing these calls at home? So, I'm not sure if any of you guys have had a chance to read this or see the actual presentation. There was a needs assessment that was done in 2009 looking at VRI. At that time, it was still kind of an emerging technology. And the National National Consortium of Interpreter Education Centers worked with some interpreters and then also with some consumers of VRI. They spoke with folks that were deaf, hard of hearing, and deaf-blind, and really tried to get their perception of what VRI was and the direction that it was going. And so we're going to talk a little bit about this needs assessment. I forgot to mention at the beginning, at the very end of this PowerPoint, all of the resources are all listed. So there's a link to this actual study if you want to read it. All of the apps, websites, everything are all listed on the last 4 or 5 slides of the presentation. So the goals of the needs assessment really was several-fold. One of them was to kind of create a network of stakeholders, a network of individuals that were involved in VRI, whether that be consumers of VRI or folks that were paying for it. And then also to somehow look at competencies of the interpreters that were currently doing VRI. Again, it's not regulated by the FCC, so there really is there's no requirement or no oversight regarding the interpreters that are selected to do VRI. And also, the needs assessment was looking at what are we doing now and what is working and what's not working. And also to develop a curriculum was the goal of the needs assessment. And we're going to talk briefly about what the needs assessment found out. Again, this is in 2009. So of the 248 participants that were consumers or users of VRI, some of them, again, were deaf, hard of hearing, or deaf-blind. So this is when they said, this is what they said about how VRI was used. So last minute, there wasn't an interpreter available 41% of the time. Community interpreters are unavailable on site, 29.7%. VRI was the only option provided by the office or the company, 23.6%. So 23.6% of the time they used VRI, they had no other option, they were forced to use it. And preference for VRI in specific situations, 23.1% of folks said, I prefer to use VRI in this setting. And then they cited a list of other reasons as well. So again, that was of 248 people who used VRI. So when we think about VRI and how it plays into the future, honestly, I think it's gonna impact our role as interpreters in a big way in the future. Whether we want to embrace it or not, the technology will continue to develop and will become perfected, and a lot of what we do will then become through VRI. And so my question is, what do you guys think are times that it's not effective? When do you think that VRI is not the best option?
When there's an awful lot of environmental factors to be considered, and all you have is a microphone.
Yeah, absolutely. So, for example, even if we were in this room right here, it would be very difficult to use VRI because it would be difficult to track who was speaking. This would be one setting. Group therapy, when you're doing mental health, is another spot that it's difficult to use VRI. It's interesting, I spoke with a company recently, 2 or 3 weeks ago, and they're developing technology where their VRI cards are going to have a touch screen, so literally you just touch whatever language that you want, and the camera will be separate from the monitor, and the monitor was significant in size. It was about a 32-inch TV from what I remember, and the interpreter could control the camera on the actual stand, so they could turn it to whoever was speaking. And again, like I said, as the technology develops, as the internet connections strengthen, this is going to be the trend of what happens in our profession. A lot of what we do is going to end up being through VRI. And so we just have to kind of prepare ourselves to either accept or not the changing in technology. Again, I touched on privacy. For me, working in a medical setting and in mental health, privacy is a big thing, and one of my biggest concerns with VRI providers that allow interpreters to work from home is privacy.